The year was 1887, and the Arizona Territory baked under a sun that offered no mercy. Red dust, fine as powdered pigment, coated everything inside the Butterfield stagecoach. It settled in the creases of Mara Keating's linen duster, filmed the surface of the water in the canteen, and grated between her teeth with every breath. She barely noticed. Her focus was on the leather-bound notebook open in her lap, a relic of the man she had come west to find. Her father's hand, a precise draftsman's script, filled the pages with numbers, angles, and topographical sketches that were as foreign to her as a dead language. Yet, she traced the lines as if she could absorb their meaning through her fingertips. His notes spoke of elevation, of strata, of the maddening search for reliable water. Old man Keating was a surveyor, a man who believed the world could be understood if you just measured it correctly. 3 months ago, his letters had stopped. A wire from his last known employer, the Silas Creed Copper and Rail Company, had been curt. His contract was terminated. His whereabouts unknown. Mara, a newly certified doctor from Boston, had packed her medical chest, her savings, and his last known journals, and bought a ticket to the end of the line. The coach groaned, its wheels sinking into a patch of soft sand before lurching forward again. Across from her, a portly salesman dabbed his brow with a graying handkerchief, his face a mask of misery. Beside him, a woman in severe black clutched a Bible, her lips moving in silent, constant prayer. They were all strangers, bound together for a few miserable days by the shared ordeal of travel. Mara closed the notebook, the worn leather warm beneath her hands. Her father was not a man to simply disappear. He was methodical. He was cautious. He was also, she knew with a daughter's certainty, a man with a conscience that sometimes put him at odds with the world. The first rifle shot was so sharp, so utterly alien to the rhythmic creak of leather and timber that it seemed to tear a hole in the afternoon itself. Wood splintered a foot from Mara's head, showering her lap with pale shavings. The salesman yelped. The coach driver screamed something raw and unfinished as the vehicle swerved violently, throwing Mara hard against the woman in black. A second shot followed, then a third. The horses shrieked in terror. Mara pushed herself up, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She peered through the dust-choked window. Men on horseback, their faces obscured by bandanas, were flanking the coach. They wore long coats despite the heat, and the rifles they held were not for hunting rabbits. They moved with a grim efficiency that spoke of a singular purpose. The driver and the guard on top returned fire, the pistol pops sounding feeble against the roar of the rifles. The coach rocked again, a wheel catching on a rock, and then it tilted, slowly at first. Then with a horrifying groan of surrendering wood and metal, it crashed onto its side, sending bodies and baggage tumbling. Mara's head struck the roof, now a wall, and for a moment, the world was a kaleidoscope of white light and ringing silence. When her vision cleared, the air was thick with gunpowder and the coppery scent of blood. The salesman was groaning, clutching a leg bent at an unnatural angle. The woman was unconscious. Mara's training took over, a calm wave that washed over the panic. She needed her chest. She pushed herself through the tangle of limbs, her eyes scanning the wreckage. Her medical chest, a sturdy oak box reinforced with brass, had been thrown clear. It lay near the door, its side bearing the small, painted symbol her father had insisted upon years ago, a winding blue line that represented a river, encircled by a green wreath. A doctor brings life, he had told her, just like water. Gunfire still echoed outside, but it was sporadic now. The fight was ending. She crawled toward the chest, her hands scrambling for purchase. As her fingers closed over the handle, the coach door was ripped away. A man stood silhouetted against the blinding sun. He wore a dusty black hat, and the barrel of his pistol was aimed directly at her. But he was not looking at her face. His eyes were fixed on the chest, on the painted symbol. Before she could react, another figure moved into the frame, a blur of buckskin and dark motion. He came from the rocks, silent as a shadow, and the man in the doorway grunted. a look of surprise on his face as he crumpled forward. The newcomer did not carry a rifle. A knife was sheathed at his hip, a bow slung over his shoulder. He moved past the fallen gunman and into the wrecked coach with a predator's grace. His eyes, dark and intense, met Mara's. He was Apache, his features sharp and unreadable, his black hair held back by a simple leather band. He said nothing. His gaze dropped from her face to the medical chest, and a flicker of something she could not name, recognition or perhaps alarm, crossed his face. He reached for her, not with violence, but with an undeniable urgency. His hand closed around her upper arm, his grip firm but not crushing. He pulled her from the wreckage. She stumbled out into the blinding light, her boots sinking into the hot sand. He did not release her. With his other hand, he seized the handle of her medical chest and pulled it free as well. He was not rescuing her. He was taking her, and her property. The remaining highwaymen, seeing the fight was over and their target secured, were already melting back into the landscape of rock and saguaro. They had what they came for, though what that was, Mara could not fathom. The Apache warrior began to pull her away from the road, toward the jagged hills. She found her voice, a ragged gasp. "Let go of me!" He did not seem to hear, or if he did not care. He kept moving, his pace steady, forcing her into a clumsy run to keep up. The chest bumped against his leg. "I am a doctor," she said, trying to appeal to some sense of reason. "There are injured people back there." His reply was a low, guttural sound, not in English. He glanced back once at the ruined coach, his expression a mask of stone, and then continued his relentless march into the desert. He was not a savior. He was something else entirely, something far more complicated and dangerous. He had not saved her from the ambush. He had merely pulled her from one fire into another. They walked for what felt like hours, the sun beating down, the silence broken only by the rasp of their breathing and the crunch of their footsteps on the dry, rocky ground. The Apache man, who she would later learn was named Dasan, finally stopped in the meager shade of a rock outcropping that leaned like a tired old man. He released her arm, and she stumbled back, rubbing the circulation back into her flesh. He gestured to the medical chest with his chin. "Open it." The words were English, spoken with a slight accent but clear and commanding. Mara stared at him, defiance rising through her fear and exhaustion. "Why, what do you want?" He took a step closer, his presence overwhelming in the small space. His eyes bored into her, the symbol on the box, the waterline. "Where did you get it?" "It was a gift from my father," she answered, her voice trembling slightly. "He was a surveyor." Dasan's expression tightened. He knew this name. Surveyor. It was a white man's word for one who measured and carved the land, who drew lines where none were meant to exist. "Open it," he repeated, his voice harder this time. Seeing no choice, Mara knelt and unlatched the heavy brass clasps. The lid swung open, revealing the neat compartments within glass bottles of carbolic acid and laudanum, neatly rolled bandages, surgical tools nestled in velvet. It was the tools of her trade, of healing. He ignored the medical supplies. His eyes scanned the interior of the box. Searching, he pointed to the lid. There, tacked to the inside of the lid, was a detailed anatomical chart of the human heart, something she consulted often. But Dasan was not looking at the chart. His finger traced the edge of it. Mara frowned, confused. It was just a chart. Then she saw it. A small corner of the paper was loose. It was not a single sheet. With a deft movement, Dasan peeled the anatomical chart away. Beneath it, secured to the wood with 4 small dabs of dried paste, was another piece of paper. It was not a medical diagram. It was a map, drawn in her father's precise hand. Mara leaned closer, her breath catching in her throat. It was a section of the territory she did not recognize, a web of canyons and mesas. But what made her heart stop was the series of faint blue lines that snaked through the drawing. Lines that were labeled in her father's script not as rivers or creeks, but as a subterranean network, a hidden watercourse. And in the corner, a set of coordinates that corresponded to a location deep within the lands the government had designated as Apache territory. She looked up at Dasan. His face was no longer a mask of stone. It was alive with a cold, rising fury. He stared at the map as if it were a venomous snake. He recognized the landmarks, the sacred places that this map laid bare. He saw the blue lines for what they were, the lifeblood of his people, a secret kept for generations, now exposed on a white man's paper. "Your father drew this?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "Yes," she whispered, a terrible understanding beginning to dawn. He was mapping the region for Silas Creed. The name fell like a stone in the silence. Dasan's gaze snapped from the map to her face. The pieces were clicking into place for him, forming a picture of greed and sacrilege. Silas Creed, the man whose copper mines clawed at the mountains, whose railroad tracks sliced across the valleys. A man whose thirst for wealth was as vast and as unquenchable as the desert itself. A surveyor makes a map of the hidden springs. The map disappears. The surveyor disappears. And now the surveyor's daughter appears, carrying the map in a box marked with the symbol of water. "He did not kill your father," Dasan said, the words coming out as a flat, chilling statement. "Not at first. He used him. He made him find this place, and when the map was finished, the man was no longer needed." Mara flinched as if struck. "No, you are wrong. My father would never betray people for a mining company. He believed in fairness." Dasan let out a short, harsh laugh that held no humor. "A white man's fairness is a changing river. It flows where the money is." He looked from her face, pale with shock and denial, to the map that promised life to some and death to others. He saw it all now. The ambush on the stagecoach was not a random robbery. The Blackthorn men, Creed's private army, were not there to kidnap her. They were there to retrieve this map, the final piece of their plan, and to silence the one person who carried it. Her presence had complicated their simple task, and his own intervention had complicated it further. He had seen the symbol on the chest and acted on instinct, an instinct to protect the sacred. Now, he was left in the middle of the desert with the daughter of a man who was either a fool or a traitor, holding the very key to his people's destruction. Her search for her father and his duty to his land had just become the same desperate, deadly road. He looked at her, his suspicion warring with a flicker of something else, something he could not yet define. She was not a part of Creed's world. He could see that in the honest fear in her eyes, but she was the bearer of its poison. He folded the map carefully, his movements deliberate. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and blood. The conflict had just begun. "You are looking for the truth about your father," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I am trying to protect what is left of my people. Our paths are now one. You will come with me." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, as unchangeable as the stones around them. Dasan did not wait for her consent. He turned and began to move, his steps sure and silent on the treacherous ground, forcing her to follow. The medical chest, which had felt so heavy to her, seemed weightless in his grasp. Night was coming, and with it, the desert's cold breath. The heat of the day bled from the rocks, replaced by a chill that promised no comfort. They moved through a labyrinth of stone, Dasan navigating the deepening shadows with an assurance that felt ancient. He was a part of this land, and she was an intruder, clumsy and loud. After a time, a new sound reached them, carried on the thin, dry air. It was the distant, rhythmic beat of shod horses moving at a determined pace. The Blackthorn men were hunting them. Dasan's pace quickened. He veered from the open ground, leading her into a narrow cut between two towering walls of red rock. The passage twisted and turned, the walls pressing in closer until Mara could touch both sides with her outstretched hands. It was a natural corridor, a scar in the earth. Suddenly, the passage opened into a circular chamber of rock, a natural amphitheater with walls that rose 100 feet or more toward a darkening patch of sky where the first stars were beginning to appear. There was no way forward. It was a box canyon, a perfect trap. Mara's heart sank. He led us to a dead end. Dasan held up a hand for silence, his head cocked, listening. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, closer. They were following their trail directly into the canyon. He motioned her back into the deepest shadows, against the cold stone of the far wall. They waited. The hoofbeats stopped at the canyon's entrance. Voices echoed, low and angry. They were arguing, their words swallowed by the vastness of the space. A rifle shot rang out, deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet ricocheted off the rock high above them, whining like an angry insect before falling silent. It was a shot fired in frustration, a declaration that their quarry was cornered. Dasan flinched, a sharp, involuntary movement, followed by a low grunt of pain. Mara saw him press a hand to his left shoulder. In the faint starlight, she could see a dark stain spreading across the buckskin of his shirt. He had been hit. The men outside would wait for morning. They knew they had them pinned. He is hurt, she thought, the doctor in her overriding the captive. Dasan slid down the rock wall, his face tight with pain. He leaned his head back, his breathing ragged. The wound was not deep, a graze, but it was bleeding freely. He tore a strip of cloth from his shirt and tried to bind it, his movements awkward and one-handed. "Let me see," Mara said, her voice soft but firm. He looked at her, his dark eyes narrowed with suspicion. "I am a doctor," she reminded him. "That is my chest. Those are my tools. I can stop the bleeding and clean the wound. An injury like that, left to fester in this dust, could cost you your arm or your life." He hesitated for a long moment, the sounds of the men making camp at the canyon mouth drifting toward them. The choice was simple. He could trust the white woman, or he could trust the desert sickness. He gave a short, sharp nod. Mara moved quickly, her fear replaced by a focused calm. She opened the medical chest, the familiar scent of carbolic acid a small comfort in this alien place. She retrieved a bottle, a pad of clean cotton, and a fresh bandage. She knelt beside him. This close, she could feel the heat radiating from his body. She could see the fine lines of exhaustion around his eyes. "This will sting," she warned. She poured the antiseptic onto the cotton. His muscles tensed as she pressed the pad to the raw flesh of his shoulder. He did not make a sound, but she felt the tremor of pain that ran through him. His control was absolute, a thing of iron will. Her hands were steady as she cleaned the wound, her touch professional and sure. She worked by the faint light of the rising moon, her movements efficient. He watched her, his gaze intense, seeing not a captive, but a woman of skill. He saw the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the gentleness of her fingers as she worked. When she was finished, she had wrapped his shoulder in a tight, clean bandage. The bleeding had stopped. He flexed his arm, testing the dressing. "It holds," he said. It was the closest he would come to a thank you. Mara packed her supplies away. "We are trapped," she said, stating the obvious. "Not trapped," he corrected, his voice a low rumble. "Hidden. There is another way out. The old ones called it the breathing mouth of the mountain." He looked up, his gaze tracing a path up the sheer rock face. Mara followed his eyes. The wall was a vertical puzzle of cracks and ledges, daunting and impossible. "We have to climb," he said. "You are injured," she protested, "and it is nearly dark." "In the dark, they cannot see us. We will climb while they sleep." He looked at her, a challenge in his eyes. "You are a doctor who can fix a man's body. Are you a woman who can save her own life?" Mara met his gaze, her chin rising. "I am." They waited for hours in the cold silence, listening as the voices of the blackthorn men faded, replaced by the yip and howl of a distant coyote. When the moon was high and the camp at the canyon mouth was silent, Dasan stood. He pulled a long coil of braided leather rope from a pack she had not noticed before. It was thin but strong. He looped one end around his waist, securing it with a knot she did not recognize. He handed the other end to her. "Tie this around yourself," he said. "The same way. If you slip, I will hold you. If I slip, you will fall with me." The stark reality of his words chilled her more than the night air. Their fates were now literally bound together. She fumbled with the knot, her fingers cold and stiff, but she managed to secure it around her waist. The rope was a tangible link between them, a heavy, unyielding promise. Dasan began to climb. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his moccasined feet and bare hands finding holds that were all but invisible to her. He was not climbing the rock. He was a part of it. The rope grew taut, and it was her turn. Mara took a deep breath and placed her hands on the cold stone. The climb was a nightmare of burning muscles and scraped skin. Dust filled her throat, and the fear of falling was a constant, icy presence at the base of her skull. But the rope was always there, a steady, reassuring pressure from the man above her. He never pulled her, but he never let there be slack. He was a perfect anchor. They rested on a narrow ledge halfway up, their bodies pressed against the rock, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The stars were a brilliant, scattered dust of diamonds against black velvet. The world was immense and silent. "Your father," Dasan said, his voice quiet in the vastness. "You believe he was a good man?" "He was," Mara answered, her voice fierce. "He was honest. He would not have helped Silas Creed steal land or water. He would not have been a party to this." "And yet his map is in your box," Dasan countered, not with malice, but with a simple, unassailable logic. "He was deceived," she insisted, more to convince herself than him. "Or he was forced. I need to find him. I need to know the truth. I can help you. I understand his notes, his symbols. I can read what he saw." Dasan was silent for a long time, looking out over the dark, sleeping land. "My cousin, Naela, she is the keeper of our stories. I swore to her I would protect this place, the springs of our ancestors. This Silas Creed, he does not see the land. He sees only the rock he can crush for the metal inside. He does not see the water. He sees only a tool to wash his ore. Your father's map is a weapon aimed at the heart of my people. I must know where every one of his marks lies on the ground. I must see what he saw." A bargain was being struck on that narrow ledge, 100 feet above the canyon floor, an alliance of necessity. "I will help you find his survey markers," Mara said. "I will translate his measurements. In return, you will help me find him, or what happened to him." Dasan looked at her, his eyes unreadable in the dark. "We will look for the truth together," he agreed. They continued the climb, reaching the rim of the canyon just as the first hint of gray light touched the eastern horizon. Dasan led her through a narrow fissure in the rock, a crack barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. This was the breathing mouth. They emerged onto a windswept mesa, the canyon falling away behind them. They were free. They found shelter to wait out the day, and as the sun rose, Dasan crept back to the edge of the mesa to observe their pursuers. When he returned, his face was grim. He squatted on his heels in front of Mara. "They found our tracks leading to the canyon," he said, "but they did not find the way we left. They think we are still ghosts in the rock, but I found something else." He drew a shape in the dust with his finger. It was the outline of a boot print, but with a distinct detail at the heel, a small metal plate with a government stamp. "I have seen this mark before," Dasan said, his voice flat. "When I was a scout for the army, these are cavalry boots, the kind issued from the fort, the kind the local sheriff and his men wear." Mara stared at the drawing in the dust. Sheriff Brock Lundy, the law in Copper Bend. He was helping the Blackthorn killers. The web of corruption was wider and deeper than she had imagined. Her father had not just run afoul of a greedy corporation. He had stepped into a nest of vipers where the law itself was the most venomous snake. Dasan looked at her, his earlier suspicion replaced by a shared understanding of the danger they faced. Their fragile pact was no longer just about a missing man and a sacred spring. It was about survival in a land where justice wore a tin star and carried a hired gun. They traveled for 2 days, keeping to the high ground and the hidden arroyos that Dasan knew like the lines on his own hand. He moved with a hunter's economy of motion, while Mara felt her city-bred body protest every step. Her medical supplies were a blessing. She changed his dressing each morning, noting with satisfaction that the wound was clean and beginning to heal. They shared their water sparingly and ate the dried meat and nuts Dasan carried in his pouch. A silent partnership had formed between them, forged in the necessities of survival. Mara learned to read the subtle signs of the trail from him, and he, in turn, began to see the stubborn resilience behind her exhaustion. Copper Bend was not a town so much as a raw wound on the landscape. It sat in a dusty bowl of a valley, choked by the yellow smoke that billowed from the smelter stacks of the Silas Creed mine on the overlooking hill. The single main street was a rutted track lined with raw timber storefronts, saloons, and a general store. There was an air of impermanence about the place, as if it had been thrown together in a hurry to serve the mine and might be swept away by the next strong wind. "We need supplies," Mara stated, her voice raspy from dust. "More bandages, more carbolic, and a new strap for that chest. The old one is fraying." Dasan nodded, his eyes scanning the town with a wary stillness. "This is Lundy's town. It is Creed's town. We will be seen." Mara had thought of that. She unbound her hair, letting it fall in a slightly disheveled wave to obscure her features. She pulled her hat low. "You wait at the edge of town, near the livery. I will go in. I look like any other traveler passing through." "You do not." He did not argue. The logic was sound. He pointed to a small, dusty building with a sign that read, "Telegraph and Post. Get word to your friend, the one who writes for the newspapers. The law here is a snake. Perhaps the law from farther away has a stronger bite." She agreed. It was their only real weapon. She left him and the chest concealed in a thicket of mesquite and walked into Copper Bend, her worn duster blending with the brown and gray of the street. The town was full of miners, their faces permanently stained with rock dust, and the hard-eyed men who made their living from the miners' wages. She felt their eyes on her, a solitary woman in a town built for rough men. She bought her medical supplies and a new leather strap at the general store, paying with the last of her coins. Then, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm, she walked to the sheriff's office. It was a small, solid building with a single barred window. She had to try. She had to gauge the man for herself. Sheriff Brock Lundy was a large man who filled his office and his uniform completely. He had a florid, clean-shaven face, a neatly trimmed mustache, and eyes the color of washed-out sky. When Mara entered, he rose from his chair with a practiced smile that did not reach his eyes. He asked how he could help the lady. Mara introduced herself as Dr. Keating, a traveler whose coach had met with an unfortunate accident a few days back. She explained she was searching for her father, a surveyor named Keating who had last been employed by the mining company. Lundy's smile tightened for a fraction of a second before relaxing again. He expressed his deepest sympathies. A terrible business, that stagecoach robbery. "A band of renegade Apache," he said, shaking his head sadly. "We have been tracking them, but the desert swallows them up. As for your father," he continued, "I recall him. A quiet man. His contract ended, and he moved on. I believe. Headed for California, I heard." It was a lie, smooth and well-rehearsed. Mara felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She decided to press her luck, to play the part of a naive woman seeking the law's protection. She told him the robbers seemed interested in one of her bags in particular, a chest containing some of her father's old papers. She had managed to escape with it, she explained, but she was worried. The papers might be valuable. Lundy's interest sharpened. "Papers, you say? What sort of papers?" "Maps," she said, her voice intentionally hesitant. "Survey maps." She held his gaze. "I thought perhaps they should be lodged with the law for safekeeping, as evidence." The sheriff's smile was now genuine. An excellent idea. "Dr. Keating, a very wise and civic-minded decision. You can trust that we will examine them thoroughly. We will leave no stone unturned in the pursuit of justice for you and the other victims." He held out his hand. The moment was suspended in the thick, hot air of the office. Giving him the map felt like handing over her only shield. But Dasan's words about the boot prints echoed in her mind. This was a trap. and she was stepping into it with her eyes open. She had made a copy, a rough but accurate tracing, which was now tucked safely in her boot. She handed him the original notebook containing her father's map. Lundy took it, his fingers brushing hers. His touch was cold. "You have done the right thing," he said. "Now, if you would be so kind as to tell me where you are staying, I will have one of my deputies escort you, for your protection, of course." Before Mara could answer, the door opened and Dasan stepped inside. He had grown tired of waiting, his instincts screaming that she had been in here too long. Lundy's face transformed. The mask of the friendly lawman fell away, replaced by the predator who has just seen his prey walk willingly into his snare. "Well, well," the sheriff said, his voice dropping into a low growl. "Look what we have here. One of the renegades, bold as brass, walking right into my office." "That is not true," Mara said quickly. "This man helped me. He saved me from the men who attacked the coach." Lundy laughed, a short, ugly sound. "He saved you, or he took you captive after his friends did the dirty work. He drew his pistol, the movement of fluid, practiced motion. He pointed it at Dasan's chest. Dasan did not move. His face was a mask of contemptuous calm. "He is under arrest," Lundy declared, "for robbery and murder on the Butterfield line." A deputy emerged from a back room, a young woman with dark, intelligent eyes and a braid of black hair that fell over her shoulder. Her badge read Deputy Reyes. There was a flicker of surprise and something else, something that looked like dismay, in her eyes as she took in the scene. Lundy motioned with his pistol. "Alma, cuff this man." Deputy Alma Reyes moved forward, her movements economical. She did not meet Dasan's eyes as she shackled his wrists behind his back. Dasan offered no resistance. He knew this was the inevitable consequence of walking into the snake's den. As Alma Reyes led Dasan toward the cell at the back of the office, she passed close to Mara. Her voice was a bare whisper, her lips barely moving. "Do not sleep at the inn tonight." Then she was gone, the cell door clanging shut with a sound of finality. Lundy turned his attention back to Mara, his smile returning, colder and sharper than before. "You are a witness. Dr. Keating, you will need to remain in Copper Bend to give a statement. I recommend the Copper Queen Inn, just down the street. We will talk again in the morning." It was a dismissal and a threat. Mara left the office, her mind racing. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, distorted shadows down the main street. She went to the telegraph office. It was a small, cramped room that smelled of ozone and hot metal, dominated by the constant, rhythmic clatter of the telegraph key. The operator was a thin, balding man with ink stains on his fingers named Elias Boone. He looked up at her over his spectacles. She wrote her message on a slip of paper, her hand shaking slightly. It was addressed to a journalist she knew by reputation at the Santa Fe newspaper. She kept it brief. "Stagecoach attacked. Father's maps seized by Sheriff Lundy of Copper Bend. Apache man arrested on false charges. Suspect Silas Creed involvement. Justice in Copper Bend is for sale. Keating." Boone read the message, his eyebrows rising. "That is a dangerous message to send from this town. Ma'am." She met his gaze. "The truth is often dangerous. Please send it." He nodded slowly and turned to his key. As the message clicked out, coded dots and dashes flying across the wire, Mara felt a small spark of hope. She had thrown a stone into the hornet's nest. Now she had to free Dasan before the hornets came for them. Night fell. Mara retrieved the medical chest from the mesquite grove. She found a spot in a dark alleyway between the general store and the saloon, a place where she could watch the front of the sheriff's office. Hours passed. The sounds of a piano and drunken laughter spilled from the saloon. Finally, near midnight, the noise began to subside. A figure stumbled out of the saloon, singing a slurred, off-key song. It was Deputy Reyes. She weaved her way down the street, taking a long pull from a bottle she held in her hand. She staggered into the sheriff's office. A few moments later, Mara heard Lundy's voice, raised in anger, telling his drunken deputy to go sleep it off. The front door opened and closed. Lundy walked down the street toward the inn. He was gone. This was the signal. Mara slipped from the alley and went to the telegraph office. The door was unlocked. Elias Boone was waiting for her. He looked nervous. "A reply came for you," he said, handing her a slip of paper. He had also procured a length of rope for her from the general store. She read the message. It was short. "Have files on Creed bribing district judge. Lundy is his man. The story needs a witness who can talk. Get your man out. Stay alive. Be—" Her heart leaped. Boone was an ally. She had her confirmation. She had to move. She ran back to the alley beside the sheriff's office. She looked up. The roof was flat, accessible by a stack of crates in the alley. She slung the rope over her shoulder and climbed. The roof tiles were loose under her feet. She crept to the back of the building, where a small, barred window looked out from the cell. She peered down. Below, the cell door was swinging open. Alma Reyes, no longer drunk, gave a slight nod up at the window and then melted back into the shadows of the office. Dasan was free. He moved to the window. The bars were thick, set deep into the adobe wall. The church bell in the center of town began to toll midnight. Each bong was a hammer blow against the silence. Mara lowered the rope. Dasan took it. He braced his feet against the wall and pulled. The adobe was old, the mortar dry. A chunk of it broke free. He pulled again, his muscles straining. Another piece crumbled. On the third pull, the entire frame gave way with a grating groan, and the bars fell outward. Dasan pulled himself up and through the opening, silent as a cat. They were both on the roof now, exposed under the moon. A shout came from the street. Lundy had been alerted. They ran. They leaped from the roof of the jail to the lower roof of the assayer's office next door. They scrambled across the flat expanse of the general store, the sound of their boots loud in the sudden silence between the church bells. Below them, men were shouting, and a lantern cast frantic, dancing shadows in the alley. They reached the end of the block and looked down. The drop to the street was too far. They were trapped between the end of the town and Lundy's men. Then Dasan pointed. A thick telegraph wire ran from a pole on the roof of the post office across the street, stretching out into the darkness toward the next town. It passed directly over their heads. It was their only way out. Their only path to freedom was a thin strand of copper, the very line that had carried her words of truth out into the world. The escape from Copper Bend was a desperate, gasping flight into the darkness. They did not use the telegraph wire to cross the street. The risk of a fall was too great. Instead, Dasan led them in a perilous descent down the back of the building, using a rickety drainpipe and the uneven adobe bricks as holds. They landed in the filth of a back alley and melted into the shadows just as Lundy's men burst onto the street below. They did not stop moving until the corrupt little town was a faint, smoky glow against the horizon and the sounds of pursuit had faded into the vast, indifferent silence of the desert night. For 2 days, they pushed south, following the crude map Mara had copied into her notebook. Dasan moved with a tireless, ground-eating stride, but Mara felt the punishing pace in every fiber of her being. The adrenaline that had fueled their escape had long since burned away, leaving behind a deep, aching exhaustion. She was a doctor, accustomed to long hours and the rigors of study, not the relentless physical demands of the trail. They spoke little, conserving their energy, communicating through necessity and gesture. The trust between them was no longer a matter of words or bargains. It was in the way he found water for them in a place that looked barren, and in the way she cleaned and redressed the wound on his shoulder without being asked. Late on the second afternoon, Dasan stopped. The air had changed. It was softer, carrying a hint of moisture and the scent of green, living things. He led her through a final curtain of rock, and she saw it. Nestled in a shallow, protected canyon was a miracle, a pool of clear water, surrounded by a lush growth of cottonwood trees and ferns. A small stream trickled from the rocks at one end, feeding the pool, its surface steaming faintly in the cooling air. It was Warm Springs. It was exactly where her father's map had said it would be. The place felt sacred, a sanctuary from the sun-blasted world outside. Mara dropped the heavy medical chest and sank to her knees on the soft, mossy bank, the weariness of the past days washing over her in a dizzying wave. She dipped her hands into the water. It was warm, impossibly so, and felt like a balm on her scraped, dusty skin. Dasan watched her for a moment before moving off to scout the perimeter of the canyon, his movements as silent and unobtrusive as a hawk's shadow. Mara was alone. She peeled off her boots and filthy stockings and submerged her aching feet in the pool. The relief was so profound it was almost painful. She leaned her head back against the trunk of a cottonwood, the sound of the trickling water a gentle lullaby, and closed her eyes. Just for a moment, she told herself. When she awoke, the world was bathed in the soft, silver light of a full moon. The stars were brilliant above the canyon rim, and a gentle breeze rustled the cottonwood leaves. She felt a blanket draped over her shoulders, a rough but warm wool. Dasan was sitting a few feet away, cross-legged, watching her. He was not scouting or standing guard in the way a soldier would. He was simply present, a still and watchful figure in the moonlight. He had let her sleep. For how long? She did not know, but the deep ache in her bones had subsided to a dull thrum. She felt rested for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. She sat up, the blanket pooling in her lap. He did not move, but his eyes held hers. A slow, faint smile touched the corners of his mouth, a startlingly gentle expression on his stoic face. "You smiled in your sleep," he said, his voice a low murmur, barely louder than the stream. His tone was light, a soft teasing that held no mockery. "Was I the man in your dreams?" Mara felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the warmth of the springs. The question was too direct, too intimate, and yet it felt entirely natural in the quiet magic of this place. It was a bridge across the chasm of race and circumstance that separated them. She looked away, toward the water where the moonlight shimmered. "I do not remember my dreams," she said softly, which was not entirely true. She remembered a feeling of safety, a sense of not being alone in the vast, dangerous darkness. She looked back at him. "Thank you," she said, her hand gesturing to the blanket, "for letting me rest, for watching over me." She reached out, her fingers brushing against the back of his hand where it rested on his knee. It was a simple gesture of gratitude, but it lingered. His skin was warm, his hand strong and steady. He did not pull away. Their eyes met and held for a beat longer than was customary, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had grown between them, a thing of shared hardship and quiet respect. In that look, she was not a white woman, a doctor, a stranger. She was Mara, and he was not just an Apache warrior. He was Dasan. A voice, calm and clear as the spring water, spoke from the shadows. The heart of the land should not be guarded by a man with a divided heart. A woman stepped into the moonlight. She was older than Dasan, her face a beautiful map of fine lines, her long gray hair held back in two thick braids. She wore a simple buckskin dress adorned with intricate beadwork, and she carried herself with an authority that was absolute and serene. It was Nayla. Dasan rose to his feet, not in alarm but in deep respect. "Nayla," he said. Her eyes, dark and piercingly intelligent, were not on him. They were fixed on Mara. She took in the medical chest, the copied map that lay beside it, and Mara's tired but determined face. "You bring the Iron Man's poison into a sacred place," she said. Her voice was not accusatory, but a statement of fact. "This water is the life of the people. It is the blood of our mother. Silas Creed plans to build a dam across this canyon. He will stop the heart, and the land will die. Our people will die with it." Mara felt a chill run through her, the fear of being misunderstood, of being seen as a part of the disease she was trying to fight. "I am not with him," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "I am trying to stop him. I am looking for my father." Nayla took a step closer. From a small pouch at her belt, she took a braided cord of dried cedar. She lit one end with a flint and steel, and a fragrant white smoke curled into the still night air. She held the smoldering cedar out, letting the smoke wash over Mara. It was not threatening, but it was a profound and searching act. "Why are you here?" Nayela asked, her eyes holding Mara's. "For the man who sired you, or for the truth his marks on that paper have uncovered?" The question went straight to the core of Mara's own confused heart. At first, she had come only for her father, but now, seeing this place, understanding what was at stake, it had become something more. "For both," Mara answered, her voice clear and unwavering. "The truth about my father is tied to the truth of this water. Justice for him means justice for this land. I give you my word, I will not see it destroyed." Nayela watched her for a long, silent moment, the cedar smoke swirling between them like a veil. Dasan stood by, silent, his face a mask of conflict. He had brought this woman here, vouched for her with his actions. His honor was now entwined with hers. Nayela finally gave a slow, deliberate nod. "A word is a seed," she said. "It can grow into a tree that gives shelter, or a weed that chokes the life from the ground. We will see what kind of seed you have planted tonight." She turned her gaze to Dasan. The tenderness was gone, replaced by a grim urgency. "The danger is greater than you know. Lundi and his paid guns are not your only concern." A message came on the wind. "Silas Creed has sent for new men. They are not miners or railroad guards. They are hunters of men, from Kansas. They are professionals, and they are coming." The quiet peace of the sanctuary was shattered. The warm, gentle night suddenly felt cold and full of unseen threats. The brief, fragile moment of connection between Mara and Dasan was over, replaced by the harsh reality of their fight. The stakes had been raised. It was no longer a matter of escape, but of a coming war for the very heart of the land. Nayela's warning settled like a shroud over the tranquil beauty of the springs. The sanctuary was no longer a refuge, but a temporary hiding place in the path of a storm. The professional men from Kansas, the words echoed in the quiet canyon, a promise of a more ruthless and efficient kind of violence. They left before dawn, melting back into the harsh landscape that Nayela had disappeared into just as silently hours before. She had given them a direction, a place to look for the first of the survey markers her father had placed. Their new purpose was a race. They were no longer just running. They were hunting for a specific kind of truth, a truth etched onto brass plates and piled in stones. Mara's copied map was their guide, but it was Dasan's innate understanding of the terrain that gave them speed. He found the game trails that were invisible to her, the washes that offered cover from the sky, the slight depressions in the land that hinted at firmer ground for walking. He moved with a renewed urgency, the grim set of his jaw revealing the weight of Nayela's warning. The threat was no longer just to a sacred place, but to his cousin, his family, the last remnants of his people. Mara saw the shift in him. The quiet teasing of the previous night was gone, replaced by the focused intensity of a warrior preparing for battle. She felt a pang of guilt, a cold fear that her arrival had been the catalyst that had brought this new, deadlier threat down upon them all. She pushed the feeling aside. Guilt was a luxury she could not afford. She focused on the map, on her father's spidery handwriting, translating his coded measurements into landmarks they could find. After a day of hard travel, they were low on food. Dasan knew a place, a small, isolated trading post run by a man who dealt with prospectors and natives alike, a man who asked few questions as long as a customer's coin was good. They approached with caution, but the small, dusty outpost seemed quiet. The proprietor was a wiry old man named Jedediah, a mule driver Mara recognized from a brief stop on her stagecoach journey. He had a face like a dried apple and shrewd, watery eyes. He greeted them with a gap-toothed smile, his gaze lingering on Mara for a moment in vague recognition before flicking to Dasan. He sold them dried jerky and a small bag of cornmeal without comment. But as they were leaving, he called out, "Heard that stage you were on got hit. Terrible business. Word is the sheriff is looking for a woman doctor traveling alone. Says she might be a witness." Mara's blood ran cold. He knew. "I am on my way to visit family," she said, forcing a casual tone. "I did not see much of what happened." Jedediah just nodded, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Well, you be careful out here. It is a dangerous country for a woman, especially one asking about surveyors. The veiled threat hung in the air. They left quickly, the old man's words a poison dart in Mara's back. Dasan said nothing until they were miles away, hidden in a rocky defile. His eyes were smiling, but his heart was a liar. He said, his voice flat, "He will sell our direction for a few of Creed's dollars. We have to move faster." They pushed on through the afternoon, the sun a hammer against their skulls. Late in the day, following a long, curving ridge, Mara recognized a distinctive rock formation from her father's notes, a spire that looked like a praying monk. According to his calculations, the marker should be nearby, at the base of the ridge where a dry wash began. They found it half buried in the sand. It was not a large monument, just a carefully constructed pile of flat stones, a cairn. At its base was a brass plate secured to a larger, flat rock. It was tarnished by the sun and wind, but the markings were clear. There was a survey number, and below it, 2 initials, O.K., Old Man Keating. Mara knelt, her fingers tracing the letters of her father's name. A wave of emotion, a mixture of grief and fierce pride washed over her. It was real. He had been here. This small, humble pile of stones was a testament to his presence, his work. But it was more than that. As she studied the location, she understood what he had done. Under the existing territorial water laws, the first person to claim and put a water source to beneficial use had the primary right to it. By placing an official survey marker here, at the head of a watershed that fed the springs, her father had not been mapping the water for Silas Creed. He had been recording its existence for the public record, establishing a legal claim that belonged not to a corporation, but to the land itself and to whoever lived on it. It was a shield, a piece of paper justice meant to stand against an army. Dasan understood it too. He looked from the marker to the distant mountains where his people lived. "Your father was an honest man," he said, his voice quiet with a newfound respect. He tried to use his law to protect the land. The moment of quiet triumph was shattered by the sharp crack of a rifle. The shot came from the ridge above them. Dust exploded from the rock a few feet from Mara's head. They were exposed, trapped in the open wash. Another shot, and another. They were not alone. A half-dozen men were descending from the ridge, their rifles blazing. They were not the rough miners or railroad guards from before. These men moved with a cold, disciplined precision. They wore long dusters and the confident swagger of men for whom killing was a trade. The men from Kansas had arrived. "Run!" Dasan yelled, shoving her toward the cover of the wash. He drew the knife at his belt, his only weapon. He was not trying to win. He was buying her time. Mara scrambled down the loose gravel of the wash, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked back and saw Dasan charge not away from the fight, but toward it, a desperate, valiant attempt to create a diversion. He was overwhelmed in seconds. She saw him go down under a pile of bodies, fighting like a cornered wolf, but the numbers were too great. She did not stop running. Tears of fear and rage streamed down her face, leaving clean tracks in the dust on her cheeks. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs were numb. Following the winding path of the dry riverbed, the wash led her into a deeper ravine, and she heard a new sound, a rhythmic, mechanical roar that grew steadily louder. It was the sound of industry, of rock being crushed and ground to dust. Ahead, a wooden trestle bridge spanned the ravine. It was a crude, temporary structure built to carry a small, narrow-gauge railway line. The tracks disappeared into the mouth of a mine on the far side. The roar was coming from there. She ducked under the bridge, pressing herself into the deep shadows beneath the heavy timbers, just as the sound of horses approached. She held her breath, her body rigid with terror. The riders clattered onto the bridge above her. Their voices were clear in the still air. "He put up a hell of a fight for one man," one of them said, his voice carrying a grudging respect. "He will not be fighting much longer." Another voice answered, this one colder, harder. "The boss wants to see him." Mara peered through a gap in the planks. She could see them clearly. The Kansas men. And they had Dasan. His hands were bound behind his back, a rope around his neck. His face was bruised and bleeding, but his head was high, his eyes blazing with a defiant hatred that made them flinch. They were leading him like an animal toward the mine. Then she heard the words that stopped her heart. "I do not know why the boss wants to keep the old man alive," a third man grumbled. "He is more trouble than he is worth." "Creed needs his water guide," the cold voice answered. "At least until the dam is finished and the spring is dry. After that, the old surveyor can have an accident, just like this one will." They laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed in the ravine. They moved on, their laughter and the sound of their horses fading, replaced by the relentless, grinding roar of the ore crusher. Mara was left alone in the shadows, the world tilting on its axis. Her father was alive. He was a prisoner, a water guide, and Dasan was being taken to join him, to be silenced. The truth was a horror far worse than she had imagined. She sank to the ground, her body trembling uncontrollably. For a moment, all she wanted to do was run, to disappear into the desert and never look back, to flee this nightmare of greed and violence. That was one path. Another path was to try and reach Santa Fe, to find a federal marshal, to bring the weight of the law down on Silas Creed and Brock Lundy. It was the sensible path, the legal path. But it was slow. It would take weeks, weeks that her father and Dasan did not have. Then there was the third path, the insane path. The mine was a fortress, the camp a hornet's nest of hired guns. But it was where her father was. It was where Dasan was being taken. And it was where the proof must be, the weapon that could bring the whole corrupt enterprise crashing down. The ledgers, the books that tracked the flow of money, the bribes, the payroll for the men from Kansas. The proof Elias Boone had hinted at. To get that book would be to hold the heart of the snake in her hand. She looked at her own hands. They were shaking. The fear was a living thing inside her, a cold, coiling serpent. But as she looked at them, she saw not just a doctor's hands, hands meant to heal. She saw the hands that had cleaned Dasan's wound, that had held a rope on a high cliff face, that had copied a map by moonlight. They were shaking, but they were capable. Her choice was made. Her goal was no longer just to find her father. It was to tear Silas Creed's empire down to its foundations. It was to free Dasan. She had come west seeking a man, but she had found a war. Survival was no longer enough. It was time to lead, to fight back. Courage, she thought, was not the absence of fear. It was doing the right thing even when your hands were still shaking. She rose to her feet, the roar of the ore crusher a monstrous heartbeat, and began to walk toward the lion's den. The journey back to Copper Bend was a trial by fire. Mara moved under the cover of darkness, her path lit by a sliver of moon. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like the hoofbeats of pursuing riders. The fear that had paralyzed her under the bridge had been transmuted by rage into a cold, hard resolve. She was no longer the hunted. She was the hunter. She skirted the town and went directly to the small adobe house at the far end of the street, the one she had seen Deputy Alma Reyes enter alone the night before. She waited in the shadows, her heart a steady, determined drum, until a single lamp glowed to life in the window. She knocked softly. The door opened a crack. Alma Reyes's face appeared, her expression wary, her hand resting on the pistol at her hip. When she saw Mara, her eyes widened in shock. She pulled Mara inside and quickly bolted the door. "They found your tracks," she whispered, her voice urgent. "Lundy has men combing the hills. They think you fled south. What happened? Where is the Apache?" "He was captured," Mara said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "They took him to Creed's mining camp. And my father, he is there too, alive, a prisoner." Alma's face paled. She sank onto a small wooden chair. "The whole rotten business is coming apart." Mara looked at the young deputy, seeing the exhaustion and the fear in her eyes, but also a core of decency that had not yet been eroded by the corruption around her. "I am going back for them," Mara said, and I am going to burn Silas Creed to the ground. But I cannot do it alone. I need your help." Alma looked down at her hands. "Lundy will kill me." "He will kill you anyway, sooner or later," Mara countered. "You know too much. You helped Dasan escape. You are already a part of this. You can either die on your knees as Creed's servant, or you can fight on your feet with me." The words hung in the small, lamp-lit room. Alma Reyes looked up, and the fear in her eyes was slowly replaced by a spark of defiance. "What do you need me to do?" The plan was forged in the back room of the telegraph office, the air thick with the smell of hot metal and the low hum of the batteries. Elias Boone, his face pale and beaded with sweat, listened as Mara laid it out. His hands, usually so steady on the telegraph key, trembled slightly. "You are asking me to be a thief and a conspirator," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I am asking you to be a newspaperman," Mara corrected him gently. "I am asking you to help get the truth onto the wire." The plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal. It had two parts that had to happen at the same time. The first part belonged to Mara. She would get into Silas Creed's office at the mine and take his ledger, the book that detailed his payments to Lundy, to the judge, to the men from Kansas. Alma had told them when to strike during the late-night shift change, when the mine was at its loudest and the guards were distracted. The second part was the rescue. While Mara was inside, Alma would create a diversion. A few barrels of kerosene accidentally spilled near the stables, a small fire that would draw every available man. In the ensuing chaos, she would free Dasan and Mara's father from the holding shed where new prisoners were kept. Elias Boone's role was critical. Mara would bring the ledger directly to him. He would use the office's letterpress, a machine designed for making copies, to create an impression of the key pages. Then, he would translate the incriminating entries into code and wire them directly to the federal marshals in Santa Fe, using the authority of the press as his shield. He would be sending the lightning bolt that could, with luck, start a fire of true justice. "It is a good plan," Elias said, a new resolve hardening his voice. "It is a good day to make the news." The mining camp was a vision of hell. The ore crusher roared day and night, a monstrous, grinding noise that shook the very ground. Yellow smoke poured from the smelter, poisoning the air. Armed guards were everywhere. Mara, her face and clothes deliberately dirtied with dust and grease, slipped into the camp with a group of workers' wives bringing late-night meals. She kept her head down, her medical chest, now stripped of its distinctive symbol, looking like any other box of goods. She found Creed's office easily. It was the only building with glass windows. She waited in the shadows, her nerves stretched as taut as a wire, at precisely the appointed hour. A shout went up from the far side of the camp, followed by the orange glow of flames licking at the night sky. The diversion had begun. Men yelled, running toward the stables. It was her chance. The office door was unlocked. She slipped inside. The room was opulent, a testament to Creed's wealth. A thick carpet covered the floor, and a massive oak desk dominated the space. The ledger was right there, sitting on the blotter, a thick, leather-bound volume. Her hands did not shake as she picked it up. She was a surgeon, and this was an operation. She tucked the book under her arm and was turning to leave when a sound from a connecting room made her freeze. She crept to the door and peered through the keyhole. And then she saw him. Her father. He was sitting at a large table covered in maps, his face pale and thin. But it was him. A guard stood behind him, his rifle held loosely. He was being forced to work, to guide them to the last of the hidden water sources. At that moment, the door to the office burst open. It was not a guard. It was Dasan, and behind him, Alma, her pistol drawn. "There is no time," Alma hissed. "More guards are coming." Dasan's eyes found Mara, and a look of profound relief washed over his bruised face. He had seen the fire and known it was a signal, had overpowered his guard in the ensuing chaos. "My father," Mara whispered, pointing to the other room. Dasan did not hesitate. He kicked open the connecting door. The guard inside barely had time to raise his rifle before Dasan was on him, a silent, deadly force. Old Man Keating looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief and dawning hope as he saw his daughter. Mara. They had no time for a reunion. They pulled him from the room, half carrying him. They fled into the chaos of the camp, the fire providing the perfect cover. They reached the edge of the camp where Alma had tethered 3 horses. They mounted and spurred the animals into a gallop, disappearing into the desert just as an organized pursuit began to form behind them. They rode hard for Copper Bend, the precious ledger held tight in Mara's arms. The wind began to pick up, a low moan that promised a storm. The air grew thick with dust, the moon disappearing behind a hazy veil. They thundered into the silent town and slid from their horses outside the telegraph office. Elias Boone had the door open, his face a mask of anxiety. Inside, they worked with frantic speed. Mara opened the ledger to the pages listing payments. Elias, his hands now steady, prepared the wet cloths and paper for the press. He worked the machine, pressing the ink from Creed's book onto fresh sheets, creating a perfect, if faint, copy. As he worked, Mara turned to her father. He looked older, broken. The shame in his eyes was a terrible thing to see. "I never meant for this to happen," he croaked, his voice raw. "I signed the initial contract before I knew it was their sacred land. When I found out, I tried to back out, to protect the springs with the survey markers, but they would not let me go. They held my life over me." Mara's heart ached for him. But there was a hard knot of anger there too, born of months of fear and uncertainty. "You still worked for him," she said, her voice quiet but sharp. "You still drew his maps." He could not meet her eyes. "What choice did I have?" "You had the choice to be a man of courage, like him," she said, her gaze flicking to Dasan. Dasan stood by the door, his expression unreadable, but she knew he was listening, knew he was judging them both. The argument was cut short by the clatter of the telegraph key. Elias was sending the first of the messages, page after page of coded numbers and names, a river of damning evidence flowing out into the world. He sent all the payments to Lundy, the transfers to the district judge, the hiring contract for the gunman from Kansas. As the last message clicked out, a sudden, violent gust of wind slammed against the building. The sandstorm had arrived. It was a furious, blinding wall of red dust, turning the world outside into a howling chaos. "It is our only chance," Dasan said, his voice cutting through the roar of the wind. "They will not be able to track us in this. We have to go now." They prepared to leave, bundling the copied pages. Elias grabbed Mara's arm, his eyes wide. "A message is coming back," he said, "from Santa Fe." He turned to the key, his fingers flying as he transcribed it. "Acknowledged. Use. Marshals en route. Will arrive Copper Bend in 2 days. Hold evidence. Protect witnesses." Hope, bright and fierce, surged through Mara. It was working. The law was coming. Then, the telegraph key began to chatter again. A frantic, desperate message. It was from the next station down the line. "Lundy and 6 men just rode through, headed your way. They know. Repeat, they know." Before Elias could even stand up, the front door of the telegraph office splintered, kicked in from its frame. Sheriff Lundy stood there, his face a mask of fury, flanked by his deputies. He held a pistol in his hand, aimed not at Mara or Dasan, but at the telegraph operator. "You have been a busy little spider, Boone," Lundy snarled, "but you have sent your last message." He grabbed Elias by the front of his shirt, dragging him out into the street. "We will see how brave your friends in Santa Fe are when they find your body swinging from the telegraph pole," he roared, his voice barely audible over the shriek of the wind. Dasan pulled Mara back from the doorway. "We cannot fight them all. We have to go, now." They fled out the back, leaving her father to stumble after them. They leaped onto their horses, plunging into the blinding, suffocating storm. The world was a maelstrom of red dust and screaming wind. Mara could not see more than a few feet in front of her, but Dasan took the lead, his face set. He looked up, not at the ground, but at the sky, searching for a single, faint point of light that could pierce the storm. He was looking for the North Star. He was their only guide in a world that had turned to angry, featureless chaos. Behind them, in the town they were leaving, The price of the truth was already being paid in blood. The sandstorm was a living entity, a roaring beast of grit and wind that scoured the world clean of sight and sound. They rode blind, huddled low over their horses' necks, trusting entirely in Dasan. He navigated not by landmarks, but by instinct, by the feel of the wind and the subtle slope of the unseen ground. He was their compass in the churning chaos. For hours they fled, the storm their unforgiving shield. They found refuge in a shallow cave carved from a sandstone cliff, a place Dasan knew from his youth. They stumbled inside, leading the exhausted horses into the relative calm, their bodies aching, their lungs raw from breathing dust. The storm howled outside, a constant mournful shriek, in the deep, windless dark of the cave. The silence was a heavy blanket. Mara lit a small, shielded lantern, the tiny flame casting huge, dancing shadows against the rock walls. In its flickering light, she saw the true cost of their flight. Her father, Old Man Keating, had collapsed against the wall, his face ashen, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He was not a young man, and the imprisonment and desperate escape had broken something deep inside him. She went to him with her medical bag, her movements weary but sure. She gave him water and checked his pulse. It was weak, thready. "You need to rest," she told him, her voice softer than she intended. He looked up at her, his eyes hollow with a guilt that seemed to have consumed him from the inside out. "I cannot rest. Mara, the things I have done." He choked on the words. "I signed the first drawing for Silas. Before I knew, it was a preliminary sketch, just a simple survey of the topography. He paid me well. He spoke of progress, of bringing water to the new settlements. I believed him." His voice broke. "By the time I realized it was your mother's people's sacred land, by the time I understood what he meant to do, I was already caught. I tried to use the official markers to create a public claim, to protect it with the law. But he found out. He took my journals, my freedom. He made me his creature, his water guide. Every day a prisoner, every day a traitor." He was weeping now, silent, desperate tears that carved paths through the grime on his face. Mara felt her own anger, the hard knot of resentment she had carried, begin to dissolve, replaced by a vast, weary pity. He was not a villain. He was just a weak man who had made a terrible mistake and had paid for it dearly. Dasan, who had been tending to the horses, stood in the shadows at the mouth of the cave, a silent witness to the painful confession. He did not judge. He did not condemn. He simply listened. As the storm began to subside, a new light appeared on the horizon, a hellish orange-red glow that pulsed against the dark, roiling clouds. It was in the direction of Copper Bend. "They are burning the town," Dasan said, his voice a low, grim whisper. "No," Mara said, a terrible certainty dawning on her. "Not the whole town, just enough." Creed was not just a thief and a murderer. He was a master of narratives. He was not just destroying evidence or covering his tracks. He was creating a story for the federal marshals when they arrived, a story of a savage Apache uprising, of a town under siege, a story in which he and Lundy were the heroes, the saviors. And she knew, with a certainty that made her blood run cold, who would be the villain. "We have to go back," she said. "Elias, Alma, they are still there." "It is a trap," Dasan warned. "He wants you to return." "I do not care. They are our friends. They risked their lives for us." They left her father with the horses in the relative safety of the cave and made their way back toward the town on foot, moving through the pre-dawn darkness like ghosts. The smell of smoke grew stronger, acrid and choking. As they drew closer, they could hear the sounds, the crackle of flames, the splintering of timber, and something far worse, the sound of a mob. It was a low, guttural roar, fueled by whiskey and fear, a single beast with 100 heads, all screaming the same words. "Apache, kill them, kill the savages." They crept to the edge of the town. A row of shacks and a small warehouse on the poorer side of the street were engulfed in flames. A deliberate, contained arson designed for maximum visual effect. In the middle of the street, silhouetted against the fire, a crowd of miners and railroad workers swayed and shouted. They were dragging a man toward the telegraph pole. It was Elias Boone. His face was bloody, his shirt torn. Sheriff Lundy was at the head of the mob, his pistol in his hand, a look of righteous fury on his face as he played to the crowd. "This is what happens to traitors," Lundy bellowed. "This is what happens to Indian lovers who would see this town burned to the ground." A rope was thrown over the crossbar of the telegraph pole. The mob roared its approval. Mara started to move, to scream, to do something, anything. But Dasan's hand on her arm, strong as an iron band, held her back. Suddenly, a figure pushed through the crowd. It was Alma Reyes, her face set and determined. She had her pistol drawn. "Let him go! Lundy!" she commanded, her voice ringing out with an authority that momentarily silenced the crowd. "This is not justice! This is a lynching!" Lundy turned, a look of genuine surprise on his face. "Stand down, deputy. This is not your affair." Alma took another step forward. "I will not. You work for Creed, not the law. I will not let you murder this man." For a moment, no one moved. It was a standoff in the firelight. Then from the side, one of Lundy's men, a man from Kansas, raised his rifle. A single shot cracked through the air. Alma staggered, a dark stain blossoming on the front of her shirt. She fired her own pistol as she fell, the shot going wide. The mob, startled from its trance, surged forward. In that instant of chaos, Dasan made his choice. He looked at Mara, his face a mask of sorrow and resolve. He saw the fire, the mob, the dying woman who had tried to help them. He saw himself as the cause, the spark that had ignited this inferno. "Get her," he said, his voice a raw command. He meant Alma. "I will draw them away." Before Mara could protest, he was gone. He did not run or sneak. He stood up and walked into the firelight, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. He was a solitary, proud figure against the backdrop of flames and chaos. The mob saw him. A new roar went up, a sound of pure, unadulterated hatred. They turned from Elias, who crumpled to the ground, and swarmed toward this new, more satisfying target. Lundy smiled, a predator's smile, as his prize walked directly into his hands. Mara did not watch. She ran, her medical bag banging against her side, to where Alma lay in the street. With Elias's help, she dragged the wounded deputy into the deep shadows of an alleyway. Alma was conscious, barely. The wound was in her chest, high on the right side. It was bad. Mara tore open her shirt, her hands already stained with blood, and began to work. Her mind a cold, clear space of medical procedure. Stop the bleeding, pack the wound, pray. Through the narrow opening of the alley, she could see the scene unfolding. The mob had dragged Dasan to the center of the street, near a hastily constructed gallows that had not been there before. Lundy was making a speech, his words lost in the noise, but his gestures were clear. He was the hero, delivering the villain to justice. Mara watched, her hands working on Alma, her heart breaking into 1,000 pieces. She saw Lundy's men shove Dasan toward the platform. As he stumbled, a small object, something he wore on a leather thong around his neck, caught on a man's coat and snapped. It fell to the dust, a small, pale object, a necklace made of intricately carved bone. A deputy kicked it aside with his boot, grinding it into the dirt. Mara's breath hitched. She had seen him touch that necklace 100 times on the trail, a subconscious, grounding gesture. It was a part of him, and now it lay broken in the filth, a symbol of his life about to be extinguished. He was going to die. Because of her. The weight of it was a physical blow, crushing the air from her lungs. Everything was lost. The world seemed to slow down. The roar of the mob, the crackle of the fire, the intermittent, panicked clang of the church bell all faded into a dull hum. She felt a hand, weak but insistent, clutch at her arm. She looked down. Alma's eyes were open, filmed with pain, but lucid. She was trying to speak, her lips barely forming the words. "Not dead," she whispered, her voice a thread of sound. Mara leaned closer, pressing her ear to the dying woman's lips, desperate to catch the words. "The train," Alma breathed, a final, ragged gasp. They moved him. Silas's night train. And then her eyes closed. Her hand went limp. And she was gone. The words remained, hanging in the air. An impossible, unbelievable message. He was not dead. They were not going to hang him. It was all a show for the mob. They were moving him. Mara looked up from her friend's still face, the tears on her own cheeks turning to ice. The despair, the crushing weight of loss, was burned away in an instant, replaced by a single, blazing point of focus. The night was at its darkest, but Alma Reyes had just lit a single candle, and by its light, Mara saw a new path forward, a desperate, final, bloody track leading out of hell. Alma's last words were a key, turning a lock in the chaos of Mara's mind. The train. It was not a random act of transport, it was a calculated move. Silas Creed was not merely silencing a witness, he was moving a valuable asset. An Apache who knew the secret of the springs, to a more secure location. The fire, the mob, the mock hanging it was all a grand piece of theater designed to distract the town while the real prize was spirited away. Grief was a fire that could either consume or forge. In the dark alley, kneeling beside the body of a woman who had died for the truth, Mara felt the fire burn away her despair, leaving behind the hard, unyielding steel of purpose. She gently closed Alma's eyes, a doctor's final, futile act of care. "Elias," she said, her voice devoid of tremor. "Her father, the horses. We need to go." Elias Boone, his face a mask of dried blood and shock, nodded numbly. He had seen the worst of men in the last hour, but in Mara's eyes, he saw a resolve that defied it. He helped her to her feet. Before they left, Elias ducked back into the wreckage of his office. He returned with a small, heavy object wrapped in oilcloth, a signal pistol. "For the marshals," he said, his voice hoarse. "If you can give them a sign, a direction. They rode hard. They may be closer than we think." They retrieved her father and the horses, the old man now moving with a stunned, silent obedience. As they mounted, the sky, which had been choked with dust and smoke, finally broke. It was not a gentle spring shower, but a violent, unseasonal deluge. Fat, cold drops hammered the dry earth, turning the dust to a thick, running mud in seconds. The fire in the town hissed and steamed, fighting a losing battle against the heavens. The private rail line from Creed's mine cut a straight, dark path across the desert floor. In the distance, Mara could see the single, baleful eye of a locomotive's headlamp, moving steadily away from them. That was their target. They spurred their horses, riding into the teeth of the rain, the world a chaos of drumming water and slick, treacherous ground. Behind them, a new sound cut through the storm, the thud of hoofbeats. Disciplined and fast, Lundy had not been fooled for long. A party of Blackthorn riders was in pursuit, their dark forms barely visible in the downpour. Mara's mind raced, her thoughts as frantic as the storm. She was a doctor, a scientist. She thought in terms of systems, of cause and effect, and she remembered her father's maps, the intricate details she had studied for weeks. She recalled a specific annotation near the trestle bridge, where Silas's men had built a temporary dam and a sluice gate to divert the seasonal creek for their construction work. The creek, usually a dry bed, would now be a raging torrent. The makeshift dam would be holding back a growing lake of floodwater. "There!" she shouted over the wind, pointing not toward the train, but veering away, toward a low point in the hills. Dasan had taught her to read the land. She now saw the subtle contours that marked the path of the wash. Her father and Elias followed without question, trusting her sudden, fierce certainty. They galloped toward the diversion dam. It was a crude structure of earth and timber, and water was already spilling over the top in a muddy cascade. The sluice gate was a simple, heavy wooden panel held in place by a large iron lever. The pursuing riders were closing the distance, fanning out to cut them off. Mara leaped from her horse. The lever was heavy, rusted in place. She threw her entire weight against it. It did not budge. Elias and her father joined her, their combined strength straining against the iron. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, With a groan of tortured metal and splintering wood, the lever gave way. The sluice gate lifted. The water did not flow, it exploded. A solid wall of brown, churning water, thick with mud and debris, burst from the dam and roared down the dry wash. It was a force of nature unleashed, a liquid battering ram. The blackthorn men, caught in the low ground of the wash, had no time to react. Mara watched, her face lashed by the rain, as the flash flood, her improvised weapon, swept them away. Men and horses tumbling in the roiling current. She had turned the land itself into an ally. Water, the prize Creed sought to cage, had become her avenging sword. She scrambled back onto her horse. They were safe from pursuit, but the train was still moving, a relentless machine carrying Dasan toward an unknown fate. They rode hard, cutting across the desert to intercept it before it reached the high trestle bridge. Inside a jolting freight car, Dasan was not idle. His hands were bound, but his captors had made a mistake. They had left him with his feet free. He had waited, feeling the rhythm of the train, the lurch and sway of the car on the uneven tracks. When a particularly violent jolt threw his two guards off balance, he moved. He drove his feet into the chest of one man, sending him crashing against the far wall. He spun, using the momentum to slam his bound hands, a solid knot of bone and muscle, into the face of the second guard. The fight was a brutal, close-quarters affair, a flurry of kicks and desperate grapples in the swaying darkness. He was one man, bruised and weary, against two, but he was fighting for more than his own life. He was fighting for the woman who had come back for him. He fought with the fury of a cornered panther, and one by one, the guards went down. Mara saw the bridge ahead, a skeletal silhouette against the storm-racked sky. The train was slowing as it approached, preparing for the crossing. This was her only chance. She spurred her horse into a final, desperate gallop, riding alongside the moving cars. The pounding of the engine, the shriek of metal on wet tracks, the roar of the floodwaters below all merged into a single, deafening symphony of chaos. She urged her horse closer, timing her move. She leaped from the saddle, her fingers closing around a cold, wet iron rung on the side of a boxcar. The impact jarred her entire body, nearly tearing her arm from its socket. For a terrifying moment she dangled, her feet scrabbling for purchase, the grinding wheels a blur of motion just inches below. With a final, desperate surge of strength, she pulled herself up the ladder, her lungs burning, and collapsed onto the roof of the car. She crawled her way forward, the wind and rain trying to tear her from her perch. She reached the car where Dasan was being held and found the door slid slightly ajar. She dropped inside. He was standing there, his hands now free, his knuckles bloody. The two guards were unconscious on the floor. Their eyes met across the dim, swaying space. No words were needed. The relief and the terror and the unspoken question were all there in a single shared look. "We have to stop the train," she yelled over the noise. "It is carrying explosives. Creed is going to blow the dam." Dasan nodded. He led the way, moving from car to car, climbing over crates of mining supplies, making their way toward the engine. The train jolted to a stop, the brakes screeching. They were on the bridge. And they were not alone. At the far end of the trestle, illuminated by lanterns, stood a group of men, Silas Creed, Sheriff Lundy, and behind them, a dozen hard-faced men on horseback, their slickers gleaming in the rain. They were flanked by a wagon heavily laden with wooden crates, but there was another group of riders as well, taller men who sat their horses with an unyielding authority, their badges catching the lantern light. The federal marshals, Elias Boone, his face grim, stood beside them, holding up the copied pages of Creed's ledger. The trap was sprung. The marshals had arrived, not in 2 days, but in 1. Elias had used the signal pistol. He had ridden out to meet them, guiding them here to this final rain-swept stage. "Silas Creed!" A tall, imposing man named Marshal Kane called out, his voice booming over the storm. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, bribery, and murder." Creed's face, lit by the swinging lanterns, was a mask of disbelief and fury. Lundy, His bravado gone, began to whimper, his hands slowly rising in surrender. Creed, however, was a cornered animal. He saw Mara and Dasan emerge from the boxcar onto the flatbed carrying the explosives. His story, his alibi, his entire empire was collapsing, and the woman who had caused it all was standing right in front of him. He moved with the speed of a snake, pulling a small derringer from his coat pocket. He aimed it directly at Mara. Dasan moved without thinking. He threw himself in front of her, a living shield. The small pistol cracked, the sound almost lost in the storm. Dasan grunted, staggering back, clutching his arm. It was not a mortal wound, but he had taken the bullet meant for her. The shot broke the spell. The marshals surged forward. In the sudden chaos, Silas Creed stumbled backward on the slick, rain-soaked wooden planks of the bridge. His feet went out from under him. He flailed, his arms windmilling, a single, high-pitched scream tearing from his throat, and then he was gone, plunging over the side of the bridge into the raging, muddy torrent below, consumed by the very water he had sought to conquer. Marshal Kane and his men secured the scene, clapping Lundian irons and taking charge of the explosives. As they cuffed the sobbing sheriff, he began to babble, his words a desperate attempt to save his own skin. "It was not me," he cried, his voice shrill. "Not just me. Creed was just the beginning. It was the men back east, the shareholders. They wanted it all, the copper, the water rights. They are the real masterminds." The words hung in the air, a new and chilling revelation. This victory was not an end, but merely the closing of a single, violent chapter. Mara rushed to Dasan's side, her doctor's hands already assessing the wound. It was a clean shot, through the flesh of his upper arm. Painful, but not critical. He was alive. The dam was safe. The rain was beginning to soften, the roar of the floodwaters below starting to subside. Justice, bloody and imperfect and delivered by a flash flood and a federal warrant, had finally come to Copper Bend. A true victory was not just about winning, it was about saving what mattered. And as she looked at Dasan, his face tight with pain but his eyes clear and fixed on hers, she knew they had saved what mattered most. The rain washed the world clean. It fell through the night, a soft, steady rhythm that gentled the land, doused the last of the embers in Copper Bend, and cleansed the air of smoke and hatred. Dawn broke on a world that smelled of wet creosote and damp earth, the sky a pale, fragile blue. The aftermath of the storm, both natural and man-made, was a quiet, sober affair. Federal marshals, led by the grimly efficient Marshal Kane, had imposed a new and unyielding order on the town. Silas Creed's body had been recovered from the floodplain miles downstream, a broken and muddy testament to his ambition. Sheriff Lundy and the surviving members of his corrupt force were in chains, awaiting transport to a federal court. The miners and townsfolk who had formed the lynch mob the night before had sobered up to a morning of shame and fear, their drunken fury replaced by the cold reality of having federal lawmen taking statements in their saloons. In the small room behind the doctor's office, a space that had been empty for months, Mara worked. She had not slept. She had spent the night fighting a different kind of battle, one waged not with guns or floodwaters, but with suture needles, carbolic acid, and a stubborn refusal to surrender. Alma Reyes was alive. Mara's initial, grief-stricken assessment in the alley had been wrong. There had been a pulse, a flicker of life so faint it was like a ghost's whisper. Mara had clung to it, with Marshal Kane's men helping her. They had moved Alma, and Mara had performed surgery by the steady light of 3 oil lamps, removing the bullet, stemming the bleeding, and stitching the torn flesh. Now, Alma lay pale and still, but her breathing was even. She would live. It was a victory as profound as the one on the bridge. Elias Boone, his face bandaged where a ring had cut his cheek, sat in a corner, scribbling furiously in a notebook. He was no longer a conspirator. He was a journalist again, documenting every detail, his pen the instrument that would turn a local tragedy into a national story. Later that day, as the sun warmed the damp ground, Naila came, She did not ride into town but appeared at the edge of it, a silent, dignified presence that drew the eye. She came not for vengeance, but for reconciliation. With her were two other Apache elders, Marshal Kane, a man who understood the complex currents of the territory, met them not with suspicion but with a quiet respect. It was Naila who requested the meeting. It took place not in an office, but in a small, sheltered meadow a mile from town, a neutral ground where the air was clean. Mara brought her father. Old man Keating looked a decade older, the swagger of the confident surveyor completely gone, replaced by the stooped posture of a man hollowed out by his own failings. He stood before Naila and the elders, his hat in his hands, his gaze fixed on the ground. Dasan was there, his arm in a clean sling Mara had fashioned, his face impassive but his presence a solid weight beside Naila. I am sorry, Old man Keating began, his voice a dry, cracking whisper. The words were inadequate, pebbles thrown into an ocean of wrongdoing. I was a fool. I was greedy. And then I was a coward. I saw your land not as a living thing, but as lines on a page. I helped a man who meant to kill it. I have no right to ask for your forgiveness. I only wish to speak the truth of my shame before I die. He spoke for a long time, the whole sorry tale tumbling out, a confession made not to a judge but to the people he had wronged. When he was finished, a heavy silence fell over the meadow, broken only by the buzz of a bee in a patch of wildflowers. Naila stepped forward. She did not speak of forgiveness. She spoke of balance. A wrong has been done, she said, her voice calm and clear. The earth was wounded. Our trust was broken. Words cannot unbreak what has been shattered. Only actions can restore the balance. She looked at him, her eyes deep and searching. You will teach our young people your craft, not to draw lines for men like Creed, but to understand the flow of the water, to read the rock, to know the land with a surveyor's eye as we know it with our heart. You will use your knowledge not to take, but to preserve. This will be your act of restoration. A single tear traced a path through the dust on Old Man Keating's cheek. He could only nod, his throat too tight for words. The sentence was not a punishment, but a path to redemption. Later, in the quiet of the evening, Mara tended to Dasan's wound. They were in the small, clean room she had claimed at the back of the doctor's office. She worked by the light of a single lamp, the rest of the town a distant murmur. She removed the dressing, her touch gentle and professional as she cleaned the bullet hole. He sat perfectly still on the edge of the cot, watching her. The silence in the room was different from the silences they had shared on the trail. It was not born of exhaustion or caution, but of a deep, settled comfort. Your hands are good, he said, his voice a low rumble. They know how to heal. They know how to do what is necessary, she answered softly, not looking up from her work. She finished dressing the wound, her fingers moving with a practiced efficiency. When she was done, her hand lingered on his arm for a moment. He placed his own hand over hers, his fingers warm and strong, interlacing with her own. It was not a passionate gesture, but one of profound intimacy, a quiet acknowledgement of everything that had passed between them. She looked up, and his face was very close. The light from the lamp softened the hard lines of his features, and she saw in his eyes not a warrior, not a stranger, but the man who had teased her about her dreams, the man who had shielded her with his own body. He leaned in, his breath warm against her cheek, and the world outside, the town and the marshals and the long, uncertain road ahead, all faded away. There was only the small, quiet room, the scent of antiseptic and clean linen, and the steady, certain presence of him. The lamplight flickered, casting their shadows, now joined as one against the wall. The next day, under a clear, benevolent sky, a new kind of treaty was made. Marshal Kane had sent for a circuit judge, a man whose reputation was known to be unblemished. He stood as a representative of the federal government. Naila stood for the Apache, and Mara, her father, and Elias Boone stood as witnesses for the community. They gathered by the warm springs, the water steaming gently in the cool morning air. The judge, using Mara's father's original survey markers as a legal foundation, drew up a document. It did not grant ownership of the springs to anyone, but rather established them as a protected trust to be managed jointly by a council of Apache elders and a representative from the county. The document was clear, laying out rules for sharing the water, ensuring that in times of drought, the needs of the land and its oldest inhabitants would come first, and in times of flood, the water would be managed for the good of all. It was a piece of paper, but it was a piece of paper rooted in respect, a legal document that recognized a spiritual truth. When the signing was done, Nayla approached Mara. In her hands, she held the carved bone necklace, its leather thong repaired. "This was lost," Nayla said, "and now it is found. It belongs with you." She placed the thong around Mara's neck. The smooth, cool bone settled against Mara's skin. It was not a gift. It was a bond, a symbol of a promise made and kept, a tangible link to the man who stood beside her. Dasan watched, a rare, open smile on his face. Around the springs, Apache women, with Mara's help, began planting yucca seeds, a ceremonial act of reseeding, of helping the wounded land to heal itself. It was a quiet, hopeful scene, the beginning of a fragile peace. The sense of closure, however, was short-lived. That afternoon, a marshal found Mara in her makeshift clinic. He handed her a sealed envelope. It came by telegraph. He said, "Rerouted from Santa Fe, it is addressed to you." Mara opened it. The message was not signed. It was a single, chilling sentence. "The shareholders of the Creed Copper and Rail Company extend their condolences on the tragic death of their chief agent and wish to inform you that their legal claim to the Arizona water rights will be filed in federal court next month." Mara read the words, and the fragile peace of the morning shattered like glass. They had won the battle, but the war was not over. They had cut the head off the snake in Arizona, but its body was vast and powerful, and it was coiling for another strike. A new kind of attack waged not with guns and hired killers, but with lawyers and judges in a courtroom 1,000 miles away. Reconciliation was real, but it demanded a vigilance that could never rest. The anonymous telegram was not a death knell, it was a call to arms. The threat from the East, couched in the polite, venomous language of corporate law, did not send a wave of fear through the small, battered community. It galvanized it. They had faced down hired guns and a lynch mob. They would not be defeated by men in suits 1,000 miles away. The weeks that followed the storm were not a time of rest, but of quiet, determined construction. The fragile peace was not something to be guarded passively, it was something to be actively built, day by day. Copper Bend began to breathe again, a different kind of air. The mine on the hill was silent, its ore crusher a sleeping iron beast, its operations suspended by federal order pending a full inquiry. The yellow smoke no longer choked the valley. In its place, the scent of wet earth and the faint, sweet perfume of desert wildflowers healing in the wake of the rains began to return. Mara's clinic became the town's new heart. She did not just treat injuries. She delivered babies, lanced boils, and taught the women of the town, both white and Apache, the basics of hygiene and sanitation. Her small office was no longer just a place for the sick, but a meeting ground, a place where women who had previously eyed each other with suspicion now worked side by side, rolling bandages and sharing stories. The water station, a simple covered cistern with a clean pump, was built next to the clinic, a symbol of the new order. The water that flowed from it was free and clean for all, a daily reminder of what they had fought for. Dasan, his arm now healed, worked with a quiet intensity that was a form of prayer. He did not use surveyor's tools or dynamite. He used the knowledge passed down through generations. With a small crew of Apache men and a few of the more thoughtful miners, he began to dig a series of small, careful irrigation ditches that followed the natural contours of the land. They were designed not to bleed the underground springs dry, but to work in harmony with them, channeling the seasonal runoff to where it was needed most, ensuring the land would flourish without destroying its source. He was not just a protector of the sacred, he was becoming its caretaker, a bridge between ancient wisdom and a sustainable future. Mara's father found his own quiet path. He moved into a small, spare room behind the livery and began his work. Each morning, a small group of young Apache boys and girls would gather, and he would teach them. He showed them how to use a transit and a measuring chain, how to read the angles of the sun and the stars, how to map the earth beneath their feet. He was not teaching them to own the land, but to understand it, to give them the tools of the white man's law so they could protect themselves from it. In the curious, intelligent eyes of his students, Old Man Keating began, slowly, to find his own forgiveness. The world outside of their small valley began to take notice. Elias Boone's articles, transmitted over the same telegraph wire that had once been a noose for his neck, were published in the New York papers. His spare, powerful prose told the whole story of corporate greed, of a town's corruption, of a brave deputy's sacrifice, and of an unlikely alliance between a Boston doctor and an Apache warrior. He did not write it as a tale of adventure, but as a case study in the fight for the soul of the West. The story of the Warm Springs water rights became a precedent, a legal and moral argument that was debated in law schools and halls of government. The stone Mara had thrown into the pond at Copper Bend was sending ripples across the entire country. One afternoon, a heavy mail packet arrived for Elias. He opened it in the clinic, where Mara was showing a young miner's wife how to make a poultice. Inside was a thick bundle of newspapers from back east and a letter from his editor. He read the letter, and a slow, wondering smile spread across his face. "They are calling it the Keating precedent," he said, his voice full of awe. "Lawyers are citing my articles in cases involving native land rights in Oklahoma and the Dakotas." He looked at Mara, his eyes shining. "You did not just save a spring. Doctor, you may have changed the course of the river." The news was a profound and humbling validation of their struggle. But that same day, another, more formal package arrived. It was delivered by a federal marshal, a thick, stiff envelope bearing the seal of the United States Department of the Interior. It was a summons. Mara Keating, Oliver Keating, and Dasan were formally requested to provide testimony at a federal hearing in Washington, D.C., regarding the disputed land and water claims of the Creed Copper and Rail Company. The threat was no longer anonymous. It now had an official seal. The fight was moving to a new and unfamiliar battlefield, a place of marble halls and backroom deals, a world away from the red dust of Arizona. That evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the clouds in strokes of violet and rose, Mara and Dasan rode out from the town. They did not speak of Washington, or lawyers, or federal hearings. For a few precious hours, they left the weight of the future behind them. They rode their horses at a slow walk along the bank of the small, clear stream that now flowed from the protected springs, the water murmuring over the stones. The air was cool and sweet. Mara watched the play of the evening light on the water. She thought back to that night at the springs, the first time she had felt the defenses around her heart begin to crumble. "That night," she said, her voice soft in the quiet air, "I really was dreaming." Dasan turned to look at her, a gentle, questioning smile on his face. He waited. She smiled back, a playful, mysterious light in her eyes. "But I am not going to tell you what it was about." He laughed, a low, warm sound that seemed to be a part of the evening itself. "I do not need to know your dreams," he said. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. "I chose to stay in the world where you are awake." He did not have to dream of a future. He was building one. With her. They stopped their horses and sat in companionable silence, their hands clasped, watching the last of the light fade from the sky. The horizon before them was a vast, open expanse, the distant mountains a deep, promising purple. The journey had been a hard one, paved with loss and sacrifice. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but they would face it. Freedom was not a destination they had arrived at. It was the path they were on, a choice they would make together, every single day, with every rising of the sun. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to hear where you are listening from in the comments below, so we can all connect and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like this video, And support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.